The bell above the door jingled faintly as she stepped inside, just another quiet figure in a gray wool coat that had seen better days, the kind of woman no one paid much attention to. Her hair was tied back loosely, her shoes practical and worn, and her eyes downcast as though she wanted to take up as little space in the world as possible. The gun store wasn't busy that afternoon, just a couple of men at the counter arguing over the stopping power of different calibers, a teenager pretending to be interested in hunting rifles while sneaking glances at the wall of handguns, and the clerk, a broad man with a beard who had worked there long enough to know that most of the people who came in were either show-offs or dreamers. He barely looked up when she entered, just a flicker of curiosity in his gaze before he went back to polishing the shotgun in his hands. She walked slowly, almost hesitantly, like someone who had never set foot in such a place before, and maybe that was true because the way her eyes darted from shelf to shelf held both awe and something harder to place, calculation. The men at the counter chuckled at some crude joke about recoil, the kind of banter they thought made them look like experts, but she didn't spare them a glance. She moved deeper into the store, her fingers brushing the glass case of revolvers, pausing over a display of ammunition, then drifting toward the racks of rifles along the back wall. No one thought much of her because why would they? She looked like someone's aunt or maybe a schoolteacher, someone more likely to carry grocery bags than firearms. But there was something about the way she moved, deliberate, measured, as though she knew exactly how many steps it took to cross the floor, exactly where the security cameras were angled, exactly how long it took for the clerk to glance away from his polishing. She stopped in front of a semi-automatic pistol, her head tilting slightly, and for the first time she spoke, her voice low and steady, asking a question about the model as though she had read about it in some magazine. The clerk grunted an answer, his eyes narrowing just a little now because there was a sharpness in her tone that didn't match her plain appearance. The teenager wandered off toward the exit, bored. The two men at the counter kept arguing, but the air in the shop had shifted just slightly, like the moment before a storm when the sky holds its breath. She leaned in closer, asking another question, this one about the trigger pull, and the clerk raised his eyebrows because that wasn't the kind of thing casual customers asked. Still, he pulled the pistol from the case and set it down carefully, watching as she picked it up with hands that were too steady, far too practiced for someone who was supposed to be simple. She handled the weight with ease, sighted down the barrel briefly before setting it back without fumbling, and in that instant he knew she had held weapons before. He opened his mouth to ask something, but she gave him a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and suddenly there was a silence that pressed in from all sides. She asked if he had a back room, a place where the rarer pieces were kept, and though his instinct told him to say no, something in her voice compelled him forward, like a hook pulling him in. He led her past the counter, his hand brushing the keys at his belt, and the men at the counter turned their heads slightly, frowning, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. In the back room, surrounded by racks of locked cases and dim fluorescent lights, she stepped closer to the clerk, her movements precise. He tensed, expecting a wallet or maybe nothing at all, but what she drew out was neither. It was a small device, sleek, metallic, humming with a faint vibration that seemed to sink into the walls. Before he could react, before he could even ask what it was, she pressed a button, and the sound that filled the air was unlike anything he had ever heard, a resonant pulse that rattled the shelves and made his breath catch in his throat. The keys at his belt clinked once and then fell still, his hand froze halfway toward them and his voice stuck in his chest. He couldn't move. His eyes widened in horror as he realized his muscles were locked, every nerve held captive by something he couldn't understand, and she just stood there, calm, lowering the device as though it were nothing more than a tool she had used 100 times before. A faint hum echoed through the walls out into the shop, and from beyond the door he heard the muffled clatter of a chair tipping, a strangled shout cut short, and then silence. She turned back toward him, her face still carrying that unremarkable, almost gentle mask, but now her eyes burned with an intensity that told him everything had changed. In less than a heartbeat, she had transformed from a simple woman into something else entirely, something dangerous, something unstoppable, and though he wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything at all, he remained frozen, powerless, while she began her work. The silence in the gun store was unnatural, heavy, like the world had been wrapped in a thick blanket that smothered every sound, every breath, every movement, and yet inside her own body she was utterly calm as though this was exactly what she had planned all along. The clerk's eyes darted frantically, the only part of him still free, and he could see the faint shimmer in the air where the pulse from her device had rippled outward, seeping through the walls, freezing every living being caught within its radius. He wanted to believe this was some kind of nightmare, that in a moment he would blink and wake up to the ordinary monotony of cleaning rifles and listening to regulars boast about their marksmanship, but no dream had ever felt this solid, this terrifyingly real. The woman slipped the device back into her coat pocket and began moving around the back room with an ease that chilled him to his bones, unlocking cases he knew should have been secure, yet somehow the locks clicked open beneath her touch without a key, as if the metal itself obeyed her will. She pulled down a long, sleek rifle, checked its chamber, and then set it aside like someone carefully preparing a set of tools rather than weapons of war. From the front of the store came the faint scrape of boots against tile, but people stuck halfway between action and paralysis. She returned to the clerk and leaned close, her breath warm against his ear as she whispered words that froze his blood more than her device ever could. "You'll remember everything, but you won't be able to speak of it. Consider yourself lucky. The others won't remember it all." She pulled away with that same soft, almost kind expression, but her eyes were sharp, dissecting, filled with knowledge that had no place in the face of an ordinary woman. She returned to her rifle, then selected a pistol, another weapon, then boxes of ammunition that she packed into a small black duffel bag she had carried folded in her coat. Every movement was efficient, practiced, like muscle memory born from countless repetitions, and as the clerk watched he realized she was not some thief stumbling into fortune. She was on a mission. The men at the counter, he thought desperately, maybe they could stop her, maybe they could fight once the strange paralysis ended, but even as the hope sparked inside him it died when he heard the faint thud of bodies dropping, one after another, like mannequins pushed to the ground. Whatever she had done, it wasn't wearing off, it was spreading. The woman finally zipped the bag, slung it over her shoulder, and walked back into the main room of the store. The clerk, unable to follow but forced to witness through the half-open door, watched as she passed the frozen figures. The two men who had been mid-argument, their mouths locked open as if caught in a permanent shout. The teenager half bent toward the exit, his fingers just brushing the handle of the door that now stood unopened. Even a mother who must have come in after him, clutching her child's hand, both of them locked in a tableau of surprise and fear. She paused in front of them, studying their faces, then crouched down to the child's level, gently pressing two fingers to the boy's forehead. A faint glow pulsed beneath her touch, and then she stood, the child's wide eyes now dulled, his expression slack like he had fallen into a dreamless sleep even as he remained standing. She did the same to the mother, and then the two arguing men, and with each touch the glow spread and their stiffened bodies relaxed into unconscious stillness, suspended like marionettes whose strings had been cut. The clerk's heart pounded, the only part of him still alive and frantic as she moved methodically through the store, choosing who would sleep and who would remain awake but locked in silence. And with each choice she seemed to grow stronger, her steps more certain, her shoulders squaring like someone regaining a power long denied. When she finally returned to him, she placed her hand over him. "You keep the story alive even if your lips never shape the words. That's how truth travels, unspoken, unstoppable." Her hand fell away, and for the first time he noticed a faint mark glowing on her palm, a sigil etched in light that faded as she tucked her hand back into her coat. She picked up the duffel, glanced once more around the room and then walked toward the exit. The bell above the door jingled again, the same as when she had entered, but now it sounded like the toll of a distant warning bell, faint yet heavy with meaning. Outside, the light of the late afternoon spilled across the pavement, and her shadow stretched long as she stepped into the world again. Behind her, in the frozen silence of the shop, not a single soul could move, not even to scream. The street outside the gun store looked ordinary to anyone passing by, cars rolling slowly through the afternoon traffic, a couple of pedestrians heading home with grocery bags, the world unaware that inside the small brick building time itself had been stolen from dozens of people. She walked calmly down the sidewalk with the duffel bag slung over her shoulder, her steps steady, unhurried, as if she had simply purchased something mundane and was now returning to her day. No one paid her much attention, and that was the point. Her entire appearance was designed to blend into the background, to erase suspicion before it could even take shape, and yet beneath the quiet exterior pulsed the same energy that had frozen a store full of people. She passed an old man on a bench, a pair of teenagers laughing into their phones, and none of them noticed the faint shimmer in the air around her, the invisible residue of the device she carried, like the scent of ozone after a lightning strike. Behind her, the gun store sat in silence, its door gently swinging open and shut with the breeze, but no one inside stirred, no voices rose, not even the hum of the fluorescent lights carried beyond the threshold. She turned down an alleyway, vanishing from the street view, and there she finally paused, setting the duffel bag down on a stack of crates. With a flick of her wrist, she activated the device again, only this time it hummed at a lower pitch, and as the air shimmered the duffel bag itself shifted. What had looked like a simple bag rippled into something metallic, edges reshaping, panels unfolding, until it resembled a container far more advanced than anything made on Earth. She pressed her palm against the surface, the sigil glowing briefly again, and the weapons inside settled neatly into compartments lined with strange circuitry that pulsed in sync with her heartbeat. She closed it right there, and tapped it once, and it folded back into the shape of an ordinary duffel, a disguise so seamless that no one could have guessed the truth. For a moment she leaned against the alley wall, closing her eyes as though gathering strength, and in that stillness her plain features seemed to crack, revealing the faintest shimmer beneath her skin, a flicker of light like stars glimpsed through water. She opened her eyes again, the disguise snapping back into place, and she whispered something in a language no human tongue could shape, a phrase that carried the weight of distance and longing, of duty and inevitability. Then she pushed away from the wall and continued walking, merging once more with the flow of the city. Across the street, a man in a black SUV had been watching the store for hours, bored, sipping lukewarm coffee, assigned to some surveillance duty he didn't fully understand. He rubbed his eyes, glanced at the building again and frowned. Something felt off, though he couldn't say what. When the woman passed by, he barely noticed her, dismissing her as another passerby, but a strange itch crawled at the back of his mind as if he had just overlooked something vital. He shook it off, telling himself he was tired, but the seed of doubt remained. Back inside the gun store, the clerk still stood frozen, eyes heavier with each passing second, and though his muscles refused to obey, his mind screamed in panic, in awe, in dread. He replayed her words over and over, "You'll remember everything but you won't be able to speak of it," and the truth of them already gnawed at him, a weight on his throat, a lock on his voice. Outside, the woman walked on, blending into the rhythm of the city as if nothing had changed, but the world had already shifted in ways no one yet understood. She reached a bus stop, sat on the bench beside a young woman scrolling on her phone, and waited quietly, her bag at her feet, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun began to sink behind the rooftops. To the casual observer she was nothing, a face easily forgotten, but beneath the surface every choice she made rippled outward, a quiet storm building beneath the skin of the world. And though no one knew it yet, the hour she had spent inside the gun store was only the beginning. The bus arrived with a groan of brakes, doors hissing open, and she stepped aboard without drawing a single curious glance, dropping a few crumpled bills into the fare slot before settling into a seat near the back, her duffel resting against her legs like any other bag filled with groceries or laundry, yet inside it pulsed with stolen weapons and technology that didn't belong to this world. The passengers around her were wrapped in their own bubbles of distraction, earbuds in, faces buried in screens, conversations muted behind the hum of the engine, and she allowed herself the smallest sigh of relief because anonymity was her greatest shield. The bus rumbled forward, weaving through the city's arteries, past rows of shops and restaurants glowing with evening neon, and she watched through the smeared glass window, eyes alert for any sign that her actions had been noticed, though she already knew the paralysis inside the gun store would delay discovery. She thought of the clerk, the fear in his eyes, the way he struggled against the invisible bonds, and though she had whispered he would remain a witness, she knew he would never speak, not with his mouth at least. His silence would become a different kind of testimony, an ache that spread through him and infected others with questions. Her fingers traced the edge of the device in her coat pocket, feeling the faint thrum as if it were alive, as if it recognized her, and she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the hum sink with her heartbeat. A child 2 rows ahead laughed suddenly at something on a tablet, the innocent sound piercing the dull quiet, and it struck her harder than she expected, a reminder of everything she had left behind before she came to this place. She forced her mind away from it because memories were dangerous, they weakened resolve, and she could not afford weakness now. The bus slowed again, more passengers boarding, including a man in a dark suit who took a seat directly across from her. His face was ordinary, but his eyes lingered on her just a fraction too long, the kind of look trained observers gave when they were taught to notice details. She shifted slightly, angling her body to appear casual, and when his gaze finally drifted elsewhere she knew he had already marked her in his mind. She would have to adjust. The city outside grew denser, skyscrapers reflecting the last fire of the sunset, streets crowded with cars honking impatiently, but to her it all looked like a fragile shell covering a truth few would ever know. The bus pulled into a terminal, passengers shuffling off in tired waves, and she stood too, slipping into the crowd, keeping her stride steady, her breathing even, though she felt the weight of eyes somewhere behind her. She walked through the terminal's corridors, past the scent of fried food and the chatter of commuters, and exited onto a side street where the shadows stretched long. She didn't look back, not even when she felt the faint shift of footsteps matching her pace, because she knew instinctively she was being followed. Instead, she led them, turning left, then right, weaving through alleys until the noise of the terminal faded into a hush of dripping pipes and trash-strewn concrete. There she stopped, setting the duffel at her feet, and finally turned to face the man in the suit who emerged from the gloom with a faint smile, as if this had been inevitable. "You hide well," he said, voice calm, too calm for someone confronting a stranger in a deserted alley, and she felt her pulse quicken though her face betrayed nothing. He reached into his jacket slowly, not for a weapon but for a badge, flashing an emblem she didn't recognize, one that shimmered faintly as if the light bent around it. "You're not from here," he continued, and though his tone was measured, the certainty in his words cut sharper than a blade. She said nothing, her silence its own weapon, and the man's smile grew tighter. "We've been watching," he said. "We knew someone would come eventually. But we didn't think it would be you." Her hand slipped into her coat, fingers curling around the device, and the hum began to rise like a warning growl, the air tightening with static. The man's expression faltered slightly, his composure cracking just enough to show unease, and in that instant she knew he wasn't as prepared as he wanted her to believe. The alley seemed to shrink around them, shadows pressing closer, the distance between hunter and hunted dissolving until it was no longer clear who was which, and in the silent heartbeat that followed, she realized the simple act of walking into that gun store had set forces in motion that could not be undone. The device pulsed in her grip, a low thrum that vibrated through the bones of her hand, and for a moment the man in the suit hesitated, his polished shoes scraping lightly against the alley floor as if even he couldn't decide whether to move closer or step back, and in that hesitation she read everything she needed to know. He understood its power but not its origin, feared what it could do but didn't fully grasp how it worked, which meant he wasn't one of them, not truly, only someone sent to intercept her without the knowledge of what he was facing. She tilted her head slightly, her expression calm, almost sympathetic, and in a voice so soft it nearly vanished into the hum of the city she asked, "How long have you been watching me?" His lips tightened, his jaw clenching before he spoke, and the answer came slowly, reluctantly, like he was weighing every syllable. "Long enough to know you don't belong. Long enough to know that store wasn't your first stop. Long enough to know you've been preparing for something." She let the silence stretch between them, then took one deliberate step closer, the faint glow of the sigil on her palm bleeding through the fabric of her coat, and his composure faltered again, his eyes flicking down to the duffel bag as though he expected it to leap open and reveal its secrets. "You have no idea what you're standing in the middle of," she said, her tone still low but carrying a weight that pressed against him, making the narrow alley feel even tighter. His hand shifted near his jacket again, this time not for the badge but for something else, and she caught the glint of metal as he drew a small device no bigger than a pager, a disc with a glowing center that pulsed once, twice like a heartbeat. The alley trembled faintly, the sound of the city beyond dimming for a fraction of a second, and she realized with a cold rush that he wasn't bluffing. He had something designed to counter her. Her grip on her own device tightened, thumb hovering over the trigger, but she held, waiting, measuring because the first one to unleash their power would expose the extent of it, and this confrontation wasn't about destruction yet, it was about information, about control. "They said you'd come for weapons," the man muttered, his voice lower now, almost reverent, "but they didn't say why. What's the war you're running from? Or are you bringing it here?" She gave him nothing, her silence deliberate, and instead of pressing further he smiled faintly, as though her refusal was enough. The duffel bag at her feet seemed to hum with the city itself, its hidden compartments resonating with the energy of her device, and in that moment she knew she could end this man, silence him before he could make another sound, but something deeper within her hesitated, some remnant of restraint that hadn't yet been burned away by duty. He must have sensed it because his smile widened just slightly, and then he lowered his device, not fully, but enough to signal that he wasn't ready to play his final card either. "You'll slip again," he said softly, turning as though to walk away, "and when you do we'll be there. You can't hide forever, not here." His footsteps echoed down the alley, fading into the hum of the city, and she stood in the silence he left behind, the weight of his words pressing down on her. For the first time since stepping into the gun store, doubt flickered at the edges of her mind, not about her mission, never that, but about the cracks forming in her disguise, the possibility that she had been too bold, too quick to reveal what she carried. She bent down, lifted the duffel bag and slung it over her shoulder once more, her hand brushing the cold metal disguised as fabric, and whispered to herself in that other language, a vow she had made long ago in a place no human eyes had ever seen. The device in her pocket pulsed again, echoing her determination, and she straightened, her gaze fixed on the end of the alley where shadows gave way to neon light. The city was vast, filled with millions of people who would never know what had just passed between two figures in a forgotten corner, but beneath its surface the ground was already shifting, fault lines spreading toward something no one could yet name. She stepped forward, her coat swaying lightly with the motion, and melted back into the river of humanity, another face in the crowd, yet carrying with her the storm that would one day break open the sky. Night draped itself over the city like a velvet shroud, neon signs flickering in the damp air, rain beginning to fall in thin sheets that smeared the streets with reflections of red and gold, and she moved through it with the quiet certainty of someone who had walked these paths countless times before, even though she had only been here for days. The duffel bag weighed against her shoulder, but she carried it as though it were nothing, each step measured, each glance calculated, the awareness of being hunted pressing against her spine but never slowing her down. She turned off the main road and entered a district where the buildings sagged with age, graffiti bloomed on brick walls, and the smell of fried food mixed with oil and damp concrete, a part of the city forgotten by most but perfect for someone who needed shadows more than company. Climbed 3 flights, and let herself into an apartment that was as bare as it was temporary, for walls, a table, a chair, a mattress on the floor, and heavy curtains that swallowed the light. She set the duffel down and finally exhaled, shoulders loosening just slightly, though her mind never truly rested. She pulled the device from her coat pocket, placed it on the table, and watched as its surface shimmered faintly, reacting to the air, to her pulse, to the unseen signals that threaded invisibly through the city. She pressed her palm to it, the sigil on her skin lighting faintly, and in the air above the table a lattice of light appeared, a map not of streets or buildings but of energy flows, currents running beneath the surface of the human world. Nodes pulsed across the glowing grid, some small and faint, others sharp and bright, and she traced them with her finger, whispering names in that other tongue, designations no human cartographer had ever known. One node pulsed stronger than the rest, deep in the heart of the city, and her jaw tightened because she recognized it, recognized the presence that had lingered in the alley with the man in the suit. He hadn't been alone. He had been tethered to something larger, something watching, waiting. She closed the map with a flick of her hand, the light collapsing back into the device, and sat for a long time in the dim silence, the rain tapping faintly against the window like fingers drumming a warning. Sleep would not come, not when her every nerve thrummed with the knowledge that time was short, that her enemies were closer than they had ever been. She thought of the frozen figures in the gun store, the clerk's terrified eyes, the child's unconscious face, and wondered how long before someone found them, how long before the story twisted into rumors, into whispers, into fear. The mission had been simple in design: secure weapons, prepare for the day the veil between her world and this one would tear, but execution had always been fraught with dangers, and now the game was changing. She stood, unzipped the duffel, and one by one laid the weapons across the mattress, her hands moving over them like a ritual, checking each piece with the precision of someone who had been trained for nothing else. The rifle gleamed beneath the dim light, the pistol felt alive in her grip, and as she touched them, memories flooded back, training grounds beneath alien skies, comrades shouting in a language of light, the taste of metal and smoke when the war had begun. She shoved the memories away with practiced cruelty, refusing to let them weaken her resolve, and instead she focused on the here and now, on the city that slept unaware of the storm gathering in its veins. She reassembled the duffel, checked the locks on the windows, and finally sat again, her device cradled in her lap, listening to its steady hum like a heartbeat not her own. Somewhere out there, she knew, the man in the suit was reporting to his masters, spinning the story of their encounter, and somewhere even further beyond, those masters were already drawing lines on their maps, preparing to close the net around her. But she was ready. She had always been ready. The hour she had spent in that gun store had only been the first move in a game far larger than anyone here could comprehend, and as the rain hammered harder against the window she allowed herself one final whispered vow. The next move would be hers. The city woke under a gray dawn, the rain from the night before leaving the streets slick and gleaming, and she moved among the early commuters with the same quiet invisibility as always, her duffel bag slung across her shoulder, her eyes fixed forward, though her mind was scanning every detail, every shadow, every reflection in the windows she passed, because she knew today would not be ordinary, today the net would tighten. She walked to the edge of the financial district where glass towers cut into the sky and the hum of power lines above seemed to vibrate in her bones, and as she turned into a plaza surrounded by mirrored facades in the air, the way the crowd's movement stuttered slightly, the faint prickling at the base of her neck that told her she was no longer one among many but the center of a converging circle. She didn't break stride, didn't even allow her breathing to falter, but her hand slid inside her coat, fingers curling around the device as its hum rose in response to her tension. Men and women in suits appeared casually from all directions, some sipping coffee, others pretending to check phones, but their spacing was too precise, their eyes flicking too often toward her, and she knew these were no ordinary commuters. She reached the fountain at the plaza's center and stopped, setting the duffel bag gently at her feet, and turned slowly to face them. For a heartbeat the world held its breath, then one of them stepped forward, the man from the alley, his face calm but his posture taut, his hand resting near the pocket where he had kept his counter device. "You can't keep running," he said, his voice carrying across the plaza though he didn't shout, the kind of tone meant to sound reasonable, to disguise the threat beneath it. She tilted her head, her face still expressionless, and replied softly, "I haven't been running. I've been waiting." The words unsettled him, just slightly, his eyes narrowing. The hum swelled instantly, washing out across the plaza in a shimmering wave, and the crowd of suited figures froze mid-step, mid-breath, mid-blink, the air itself holding them like statues. But the man in the alley remained free, his counter-device glowing faintly at his hip, shielding him from her influence. Their eyes locked across the frozen plaza, hunter and hunted, predator and prey, though which was which had become impossible to define. He pulled the small disc from his pocket, twisted it once, and suddenly the shimmer of her pulse began to fracture, the frozen agents twitching slightly as if cracks had formed in the bonds that held them. She tightened her grip, forcing more power into the hum, and the air vibrated so violently the fountain's water stilled, hanging in midair like glass. Sparks danced between the mirrored towers as if the city itself were caught in their clash. He took a step forward, his face strained now, sweat gathering at his temple, and said through clenched teeth, "You don't have to do this here. There are other ways. Other places." But she only shook her head, her voice like steel when she answered, "This is the only way." She pressed harder, the device glowing brighter, the sigil on her palm blazing like fire beneath her skin, and for a moment every person in the plaza seemed suspended in a reality that was neither time nor space, a fragile bubble on the verge of bursting. The man staggered, his knees buckling, but his device flared once more, and with a final desperate twist he sent a counterpulse crashing against hers. The sound was not sound but pressure, a force that rippled through the buildings, shattering glass, sending pigeons exploding into the sky, and for an instant everything, people, air, light itself, froze in absolute stillness. Then the pressure collapsed, the plaza erupting into chaos, civilians who had been caught on the edges stumbling in confusion, alarms wailing as windows rained shards, and in the center of it all she stood with her duffel bag at her feet, her coat torn at the shoulder, her eyes burning with a light no human could mistake for ordinary. The man in the suit knelt across from her, breathing hard, his device smoking in his hand, his face pale but defiant. "It doesn't matter what you do," he rasped. "We know you're here now. We'll never stop." She bent down, lifted the duffel, and with a voice that seemed to echo beyond the broken plaza she said, "Then neither will I." And with that she turned, walking into the shattered streets as sirens rose in the distance, leaving behind a plaza of frozen agents and one man struggling to stand, the city finally beginning to wake to the truth that something impossible walked among them. The streets trembled with the echo of sirens, helicopters circling like vultures above the jagged skyline, but she walked as if none of it belonged to her, as if the world had already become a ghost town abandoned to echoes, her boots striking wet pavement while reflections of blue and red lights shattered and reformed in the puddles around her. She felt the weight of the duffel, not in her muscles but in her mind, for she knew every piece of it had led here, every step since the first time she touched the device in that secret cellar, every warning ignored, every shadow endured, and now the city itself seemed to lean in, listening, waiting for what she would do next. Behind her the plaza was cordoned off, drones hovering to capture the impossible image of frozen agents who could not be explained, though the officials who rushed to the scene already worked to craft a lie, something the public could swallow, a story about gas leaks, staged drills, or chemical exposure, but the truth leaked through the cracks, spreading faster than they could contain it, and she knew soon the whole city would whisper about the woman who walked into a gun store and shattered the rules of nature. She turned down a narrow street lined with shuttered shops and iron gates. her heart, because she could sense them closing in again, not the suited agents this time but soldiers, armored units who moved in formations, their voices clipped and cold in their comms, and she smiled faintly because she knew their technology, their weapons, even their courage would falter in the presence of what she carried. A child peeked from a cracked doorway as she passed, wide eyes following her, and for a moment she paused, crouched, and pressed a finger to her lips, not as a threat but as a promise, then slipped a small coin into the child's hand, a coin etched with the same sigil that burned faintly on her palm, and the child's eyes widened further, sensing some unspoken destiny but not understanding it yet. When she rose again, the soldiers were in view, armored helmets gleaming under the rising sun, their rifles leveled, their commander barking an order she didn't hear because in that instant she pressed the device against her chest and drew upon every thread of power it held, letting it pour through her body, her veins lighting like circuits, her breath tearing at her throat as the hum became a roar. The soldiers froze not in confusion but in horror as the very street warped, lampposts bending as if gravity had tilted, asphalt rippling like water, their boots sinking slightly into the surface that refused to remain solid. One fired, the bullet spiraling forward only to dissolve into shards of light before it could reach her, and the rest hesitated, their training unraveling before their eyes. She stepped forward, her voice not loud but impossibly clear, carrying through the distortion. "You cannot stop what has already begun." Her words were not for them, not truly, but for the watchers beyond the perimeter, the men and women in control rooms staring at screens, the leaders who thought power came from weapons and rules, and as she spoke she felt them shudder, an entire chain of command cracking under the weight of a truth they could not categorize. The commander tried again, raising his weapon, his hands shaking despite the metal, but before he could fire she extended her arm, the sigil blazing, and the street itself rose like a wave, tossing the armored line back as if they were no heavier than leaves. Silence followed, heavy, absolute, broken only by the sputtering of failing engines and the hiss of twisted metal cooling, and in that silence she stood at the center, her coat whipping in the wind, her eyes catching the dawn like twin suns. She felt her strength falter then, her body trembling with the cost, the device burning hot in her grip, and she knew she had only moments before it would either consume her or fall silent forever. Yet she also knew the choice had already been made, not here, not young to hold such power, when she swore that she would never let it fall into their hands, never let them use it to enslave rather than free. And so she turned once more, walking through the ruins of the street, past soldiers groaning in disbelief, past drones that flickered and crashed from disrupted signals, walking toward the horizon where the city ended and the unknown began. Behind her the whispers grew into shouts, into headlines, into fear and awe braided together, stories of a simple woman who entered a gun store and an hour later walked out with the world changed forever, a woman who froze armies and bent streets, who